All right. So just take a look at the agenda for today. I think we have, at least at the moment, 5 different items, 2 from Per, 2 from Chris, and the last one from Eric. So just let's get started from the top. So I think Per would start with some, I'm pretty sure, catalog config. Go ahead, Per.
Yep, so we just have an ask to be able to float down pod tolerations and node selectors to the catalog source pods. And I've created a feature issue, which should be in the document there, which I'm trying to find. Just give me a sec. So that's issue 2452, and all I'm looking for, and hopefully we can move fairly quickly. I don't know if I should. I don't know if I share my screen, if everything is gonna go haywire. Let's see.
Yeah, feel free to share your screen, Per, if you want.
Yeah, the problem is I'm in Linux with Zoom. I don't know if it'll on Wayland, so I don't know if it'll work. So just bear with me. Oh, geez, Louise. Okay, tell me if you can see something. I couldn't figure out how to share the whole screen.
So, a massive black thing.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't think this is gonna work for me. Is anyone able to share the screen?
Yeah, I can share the screen if you want something specifically to share. You want me
just
to share the issue?
The issue, yeah, exactly.
Okay, I can do that. Just give me a second.
Cool. Now I have to figure out how to stop sharing. Sorry, it's my first day. There we go.
Can everyone see my screen? I'm pretty sure they can.
Right.
Okay.
So the summary is basically that, right? Like we would do something similar as we do for the subscription, where we would add a config and be able to put those things down there. So just want to check if we're happy with that approach, because it does expose some of the implementation, or if we see a problem with that, or if we have better alternatives. And then if we don't, then I'll continue with the implementation, or if we're all happy with it.
So I guess I can speak first on this. I thought someone else would speak first. I think I'm fine with this solution. I think in the past, we do have the tendency to using some sort of like annotation and label and then inject the information later on to the pod. And even though that does work, but you know, at the same time, just keep adding more label and annotation, this can become pretty hairy at that end. So I think that actually changing and make it become a view in the spec actually a little bit more elegant solution, I think. So I'm actually quite supportive with this solution. And I know you're having a PR pending on a API repo for this, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, I put a work in progress on it just to make sure we're aligned on the approach before, you know, anything gets changed.
Sure. Sure. I mean, the only caveat for this is, even though an additional field on the spec is not considered any breaking changes for the API, so it's pretty much an optional field, so to speak. In this case, you can add it if you don't need to have it, right? So it's all good. The only caveat is that we are not gonna backporting this to any previous version of OLM, so this feature won't work for anything that not in this coming release, right?
So I would need to check back. So this came from a bug, or well, the file does a bug, but it's really an ask. So I just need to check back with them to see if, you know, that's fine. Otherwise, we may hit. I don't know if we can backport or not, or what our limitations here are.
Yeah. So can I just ask, where's the source bug and where's the actual use case for why we're doing this? Is there some kind of history?
The bug's actually pretty lean on description, but essentially within OCP, we want to be able to schedule the pods, the catalog source pods on specific nodes. So I'm guessing something like, you know, whatchamacallit, like administration type nodes, or, you know, instead of just regular workload nodes.
Yeah, I generally get the whole point of having, you know, taints and tolerations and that kind of stuff. I'm just wondering from this group's perspective, if it makes sense to have some kind of track back to the source bug. Is this referring to like an OpenShift internal bug or something?
I believe so. So it's in our Bugzilla. I'm still a little bit wet behind the ears with all the different tools, but yeah, I'm guessing this is an internal thing.
Yes, I guess from a purist perspective, I guess if we're going to do upstream stuff, it seems like we should have upstream trackbacks to all the things that why we're doing them. Right. So it feels like this, I mean, this is an issue, right? So maybe just have a little bit more context of maybe even cut and paste the source bug.
I don't think it would add much. It just basically says, you know, while the operator, the marketplace operator itself does have these tolerations, the underlying created catalog source pods do not, and they need that. And I figured that was be something general enough to fit upstream, even if it's not OCP related. You still might want to be able to configure exactly where you want these pods to land.
No, that's cool. But even that context is helpful for me.
Okay, gotcha.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because I can't see anything you guys see.
Yeah.
So I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I mean, I tried to describe the problem succinctly at the top, which is pretty much that, right? Like we just want to be able to allocate these catalog source pods on specific nodes. But okay, I mean, I can add more context to that to say, you know, if you're a cluster admin or something and you want to have more control over where these sort of management pods end up.
Well, other things we'd want to have, like you know, label decorating, you know, label propagation, maybe other pod resource constraints and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we want to make it ultra generic so we could do other pod templating kinds of things. And so within our operators at IBM, we have the same exact problem, right? So we've actually created a spec for all of our cloud packs to use. So we try to propagate the same kinds of overrides. They're kind of for advanced kind of scenarios. We try not to pollute our CRs too much. Because again, like you just said, it kind of bleeds through to the implementation. I know the catalog source is a little different because it's actually, I believe it doesn't go through a deployment. It's a pod factory.
Yep.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's.
I wonder. It seems like this is a slippery slope, and like as you said, Chris, like we're gonna start wanting labels and anything else that goes into a pod spec. So I'm kind of curious, like the catalog source API already supports just not actually running an image directly. You can just tell it like, go talk to this service. And then it's up to you to run your pod source. So I kind of wonder, like, for these special use cases, should we just, rather than exposing a bunch of pod stuff, should we just, for those use cases, the guidance is, here's how you start your own pod and link it up to the catalog source?
Yeah, so take quite a few things going on here. Just first of all, I just want to say something real quick. This is indeed a Bugzilla associated with that, and as you know, that is downstream related to Red Hat only. So that's why I think that's why Pair make this specific issue as a reflection, you know, on a mirror for the upstream purposes of that specific bug. And from his perspective, it's pretty much a feature, so to speak, and I agree with that statement. So here it is. Maybe it's not including anything specific in the bug, but at the same time, I feel like it's pretty clear the fact that catalog source, as Chris already mentioned, is a part manufacturing kind of situation, and any part consider workload. So you do having some sort of you do want some sort of control over where your workload is supposed to be. So this kind of no selector tolerance is basically just workload controller. So I don't think it's the problem to basically allow to make the catalog sort to be able to do so for it's basically the part that is controlled. So that's totally fine. And back to the point that Joe mentioned, that is correct that you can actually specifically configure the catalog sort to basically go directly to the service directly, where it can basically behind that service you can point that to whatever part you want it to be. So that use case is possible, and I have seen it used before, but mostly for testing. I haven't actually seen it using in production, so I'm not sure if something we want to advertising as much as we should, because rather hacky, it's not entirely something that OM advertising, so to speak, in that case, because that's involving understanding internal detail that the part is running, but we're having a service on top of the part where you query stuff directly.
This is where I think maybe some more context from the actual issue might be helpful, because I think I agree with Joe that we already have a way to point to a service if that's all you need. There's a bunch of stuff that doesn't work. If you do that right, you can't get auto updates for your images if you're pointing to a separate pod, because it's not being managed by the controller. So if this is actually a feature request for like the default catalogs that ship in OpenShift, then the service doesn't really work because we need those other features, right? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, that's correct. I think Evan just said that if you want to update the catalog sort, you need to literally create a new pod and point that to the new pod and delete the old pod and so on. So it's own manual process if you want to update. There's no automatic update for that specific case because that's not something the catalog source controller doing. So that's a good point to point out.
But I'm saying that that's totally fine for the pods for like most cases, right? Like most people would probably be fine with just updating the pods themselves if they need a bunch of control. But if this is actually in response to the default catalogs where they land, like what nodes they land on when OpenShift starts up or whatever, then we don't have a good option. Is that what it is? Is that what this is actually about?
I believe
yes.
so.
I'm pretty sure it's for default catalog source.
I mean, the other direction we could go on this is rather than having config have like very specific pod spec fields, we could just change that to be pod spec. And then we immediately let you kind of define your own overrides for the entire pod spec from the get-go. And then we don't have to go down the slippery slope every time someone says, oh, I want to set resources, I want to set limits and requests, or, I want to set the pull policy, like every single thing is going to be someone's going to want to customize it, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And I don't particularly have anything against it. So I'm happy to change this up to actually have like the complete pod spec, and people can just do whatever they want, and then we override it.
I think Tim has a good question in the chat. I guess my question was is this actually being asked for default catalogs for OpenShift? And Tim pointed out that if it is for that, then if you were trying to override some of this stuff, CBO would blast it away, or I guess the marketplace operator would blast it away.
So here I have no background, so I can't comment.
I think my impression is that with this feature, we could set up the marketplace operator and the underlying catalog sources to have these by default, such that in the future, when these catalog sources are deployed in OCP, the underlying catalog pods would be scheduled on control plane nodes. It didn't strike me as a request for, I want to customize something after the fact.
Yeah, no, I think they want this straight, of the installation, basically.
I mean, I'm assuming I want this on my catalog too, for the same reasons you want it on your catalogs, right? So, I mean, so the IBM catalog, I'm assuming we're going to have the same problem. So I wouldn't want to lock it away, I guess, but.
It almost seems like what we're talking about here is an API that like lets you specify an image to run with some sort of automated repull, redeploy policy. Like that's effectively what this is, right? Except that like all we expose right now is just the image field. And now we're like starting to get some use cases where we want more of the pod spec to be exposed. But we still want the automation behind the catalog source that knows how to poll to see if there's a new tag, and if so, then redeploy and hook it up with the rest of OLM's machinery.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure where to go from here. Like, it seems like a reasonable ask to be able to control that. And I don't think a manual solution scales very well for what they want. So I think the only other possibility, I think, which was floated in a different conversation, which is to have some sort of global, configuration thing for OLM where you can sort of set these things. But yeah, I don't know if that's a better solution.
When you go that route, now we either have it set for all resources, which doesn't necessarily seem ideal, or you end up having the normalized, like, referential version of this, where like I have a bunch of catalog sources on the cluster and I individually control the spec for each one from that single resource, which is kind of like rearranging the same problem here. Maybe sans some of the CVO concerns, but I'm not sure how much more that buys us in terms of like solving those sort of downstream problems.
So it seems like the higher level decision is, are we going to leak the abstraction that the catalog source is like an encapsulation around a pod or not? And it seems like we've already kind of done that.
I think that's fine as long as we have a discriminator. Like if it's a union type, we can sort of do that. There are certain fields that are like only useful in certain source types already. So I guess that's to your point.
Right. And yeah, I agree that we should move on from this, but
yeah. So
sorry,
that's a good. So we only spent almost 20 minutes on this issue already. So I think Per heard all of the feedback and all of the concern question here, so he can, take a look at this feature again to see if there's an alternative solution that can address those concerns, and we can discuss in the next meeting. Does that sound good? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope to get through this way faster than 2 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's going to be end up something more than just a bug fix, then I can enhance my narrative if we want to. So that's also another solution. So that's totally fine. So let's move on to the second item here, which is also from you, from the Debbie. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think this is actually going to take a huge chunk of time. So what I would suggest is maybe try to address everybody else's, and then if we have time, we come back to this, and then I'll leave it as homework for you guys if you're interested to just have a quick review, and then feel free to just bombard it with comments or questions or whatever, and I can take them up asynchronously.
Sure. Yeah. So just want to bring it up here. So Per has some idea around Debbie work, and he had a hack MD on the agenda. So feel free to take a look and put any comment in there, and he will respond back to you. And we'll probably discuss it in the next meeting. Sound good? Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the third.
The only thing that I'll say, sorry, just a very minor comment, is I'm just really trying to figure out the mental model behind the resolver, like that we want to have. So that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, and that's it. Sorry. Thank you.
No worry. Sound good. Okay, so let's do the task item. Chris, talking about OPM render for the file-based catalog source. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so we're taking a real strong look at the file-based catalog support, and we're mostly using the 4.9 downstream to test with, and that's fairly on par with the more recent versions of upstream OPM. So one of the side effects is that we build a catalog that needs to run in all sorts of places. And so one of the first things we noticed was that the OLM, the manifests, when you render a catalog from an old SQLite catalog, all the manifests get rendered inside the bundle as OLM bundle objects. And there's a note in the upstream that talks about, oh yeah, this is temporary, and this is an alpha feature just because the package server doesn't know how to go ahead and fetch that information directly from the bundle. And so really, the problem we have is we can't use render the way it is because we have to decorate all of that stuff ourselves anyway. So render kind of becomes not useful. So I'm wondering, and then also really the bottom line is, should we have a command line attribute that generates that or suppresses that information by default? Because it seems like it should be an option, because otherwise it will not run on previous versions of any current version of OpenShift, because the package server can't read it.
So Chris, are you specifically referring to rendering bundles?
Yes.
So we fix something in the upstream such that now when you render a bundle, will always put the olm.bundle. That should solve that case. Now the downside there is that then your catalogs are going to get really big if you always just include all of that for everything. So what happens at Red Hat is that we only save the only pieces of that are actually necessary are channel heads.
Right. So I remember that from the SQLite database.
Right. So originally the plan was we're not going to render any of them by default because we eventually want to change this and we don't want to introduce something only later to take it back out. And then the plan was that then we would have another tool that goes in and looks at all the images that are in the bundles, and then looks at the images and looks at the channel entries and decides like, oh, okay, I'll just go and update this file-based catalog such that channel heads, I populate the bundle objects for them. So it's kind of like a post-processor tool. That was the original plan. Since then, we've had a bunch of feedback just like yours right now, which is like, this is kind of confusing. I built my thing and it doesn't work. So we switched render such that now everything gets it. And then what we're going to do is go in and have a tool that post-processes it that removes the olm.bundle.objects from non-channel heads.
Yeah, okay. All right. So if I start using the upstream OPM, would that start generating all of the, okay, all right.
And I think we'll probably have to talk about this, at least for Red Hat, but we probably need to have a discussion about whether that should be backported.
Yeah, so that's going to be interesting. Yeah, so that's really the next question is how so if the package server, and I don't know if that's really the only consumer of it, it's the only consumer you guys build, for that information, if that gets updated to start being able to consume bundle object-less catalogs, then will that be backported? Because we would really, really like to be able to use a file-based catalog on all sorts of versions of OLM and OpenShift, rather than having to fork them off all the time.
My guess is that changes to the package server like that would not be backported. So you basically need to maintain file-based catalogs with these bundle objects until all of the versions that still use the old package server are gone.
Yeah, because the trick is, we're going to be just the last little tidbit in this little area, and I'll stop, is that we're going to be, and we're kind of co-doing this, is building tools that the customer will use to build curated catalogs for themselves, right? So the logic for figuring out channel heads and making sure that those bundle properties are always there are going to have to be built into all those tools. And being what you just said is basically you're including everything. So they get, they're big, right? They're artificially inflated. That's kind of the safe way out, because now you're backward and forward compatible, even though they're big. So I guess that's the easiest way to get out of jail, at least immediately. So I guess just a little tidbit. I guess we're going to have to think about, when we build these tools, we're going to have to be smart enough to understand what a graph looks like and what heads look like and things like that.
Yeah, and there's, like, if you're writing these tools in Go, you can use the operator registry libraries to effectively compile this thing into the model that's internal to all of this, and then that thing gives you a way to interrogate and ask what are the packages, what are the channels, what are the channel heads. So there's definitely ways to do that right now, as long as you're using Go. Right.
And of course, DEPI will be yet another way of doing this using the kube APIs, right? Not ideal for a client solution, but definitely great for a Kubernetes solution. Okay, yeah, I think you answered my question. I'll experiment a little bit with the upstream side and see if that solves their problem. Thank you. So the next question, what was my next problem? Oh yeah. So then there's, I was just wondering how there's been, in the OpenShift side of things in Bugzilla, there was a feature for creating a veneer over file-based catalogs to give you kind of some of the handy utilities that were available in legacy catalogs, the SQLite database one, where you could actually add bundles and stuff like that a little more safely. And so there's a feature on the OpenShift side. I'm presuming this veneer is coming upstream, but I haven't seen any evidence of that upstream yet. I was just wondering if you had any more information on what that's going to look like and if it's happening.
It is. I'll let Ankita answer this, because she's been looking at this more closely than I have recently. But the TLDR that I can provide is that it is going to happen upstream. We're still very early in trying to figure out what are useful. And if you have any ideas around those, we'd be happy to have them. And I'll turn it over to Ankita to see if she has any more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So where we're at with the veneers is there's been a lot of back and forth on what we should be adding into the veneers. And the main the different use cases that we actually want to add in. So the main things that have been brought up are channel promotion, adding and removing edges to the upgrade graph, and generally being able to visualize the upgrade graph. But there was also a request for modifying bundle properties. And the thing is that with the addition of the channel object, a lot of this becomes really easy to implement without the actual presence of the explicit presence of a veneer. So where we're at currently is creating sample pipelines for these operations just to see where exactly we need to add support to make it easier to use.
So these use cases you're talking about, are these like all internal kinds of things, or can we elevate that so I can see what you guys are up to? And then I can maybe help collaborate on some of this, because I am in the process of creating my own veneer, kind of for testing, but also to do some of these use cases you just talked about, you know, including also changing the default channel, which of course is super easy to do now. But also changing, the graph edges, just like you said, being able to remove nodes out of the graph, being able to deprecate things without using the actual deprecate feature, which isn't ready yet. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of that stuff, and that'd be awesome if you guys had a HackMD that we could collaborate with. So right now it's kind of all opaque to me. I don't know what you guys are up to.
I do have a HackMD, which I can link. I'll put it in the doc.
That'd be awesome.
It's very notional though. Like this is just like brainstorming kind of stuff, but obviously glad to have any feedback on it.
I think that's the definition of a HackMD. They're all just kind of hacky brainstorming things.
Very fair.
But yeah, if you could do that, that'd be great. And then the veneer I'm building is all Bash and JQ, right? So I'm trying to stick to the basics just to try to do some real simple things. And then we're going to elevate that up into our pipelines, because our pipelines are mostly Bash driven. But yeah, if you can, that'll give me some ideas, and then maybe I can give you some other ideas around that. And I guess, I think it's still in the 410 timeframe. So I think you guys, which is like looking at like mid-December, is that still kind of a thought? Or are you guys going to potentially, it's just kind of a run at and see if what you can get done, if anything?
I don't know if we have a good answer for that yet. I think like we don't even have an enhancement proposal posted anywhere yet, which we're going to have and get agreement on. So I would hesitate to make any commitment for 410.
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be in a 410. This is just more kind of getting started thinking about it and brainstorming and forming a good plan forward.
Yeah, I get that. It's just weird because I look at the Bugzillas for 410, and I think this one has like urgent and all this stuff on it. And so it's kind of hard for me to tell really what's going to be there or not. Okay, yeah, if we could just start with the HackMD, that'd be great. We're not going to be able to adopt this immediately anyway. It's going to be definitely Q1, which we're going to start really seriously looking at file-based catalogs, but it's integral to our air gap thought, and it's also integral for our SaaS thoughts this is kind of the only way we can have predictable deployments of operators with OLM, since subscriptions do not work with GetOps. So we're going to instead control the catalogs. So file-based catalogs are awesome because they totally fix that.
I think the one other thing I would add to what like if you're mainly worried about channel-based operations and you're familiar with the normal replaces, skips, and skip range, which admittedly is pretty complex, then like what exists there is really easy to use, probably without a veneer, especially if you can have some scripting and tooling that knows how to render a list of bundles, right? I think where probably a lot of people are going to be interested in using veneers is around abstracting replaces, skips, and skip range, such that like there's a abstraction layer on top of that that's a lot more intuitive, such that an operator author doesn't have to understand how all of those things work semantically, and they can just define what they want via the abstraction. And then this veneer tooling can then go and translate that to something that OLM knows how to understand.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, except I think it's still fuzzy on what aspects of the file-based catalog override and can override bundle-based properties, right? So right now it's really the edges of the graph, but it looks like you can override all sorts of other interesting things too, but that doesn't always work. It all depends on the client. right? So the veneer can help kind of at least keep you on that happy path of what you can and can't modify. For example, can I modify the dependencies, right?
So this is a really interesting topic that has been brought up several times internally, at least. The standard answer that I always give is bundles should be probably considered to be immutable. So if you mess up your bundle, you should probably go and just rebuild your bundle and release a new version of it. They're like technically the things that are in the bundle that matter at runtime are the manifests, and the things that are in the index that are derived from the bundle, like the dependencies and the other properties, those matter to the resolver, which are pulled from the index, right? So, or from the catalog. So yes, technically you could go change the properties and some of the other aspects of what's in the index.
Except all those things you said are also part of the bundle. So you have to know which pieces of the bundle aren't really part of the bundle.
Exactly, which is why I kind of like my default answer is just don't change anything in the catalog because you're going to get them out of sync.
Yeah, but which includes channels, because channels are part of the bundle too.
So that's a good point, which is that what we're going to start doing, like if you render a bundle with OPM render, it totally ignores all of the channel and upgrade metadata. Like you don't get any of that in the file-based catalog, and none of those things in the bundle image are actually used anymore, right? So any of the bundles that you render into a file-based catalog, as long as you're never going to use the imperative commands again, you can drop all of those fields from the bundle itself.
Yeah, so that's
the idea is like in the future, bundles are kind of standalone things that don't fit in any graph or any channel anywhere. And the only way to put them in a graph or to add them to a channel is by defining that in the index.
Yeah, so I think what we need is a very explicit specification on what is going to be pulled out and what's not. What's in the purview of the catalog versus the purview of the bundle. Because they're intertwined at the moment, and we're trying to decouple that. So I think we should at least at every iteration come up with that specification on what those are, so it's very obvious. The documentation has kind of glossed over it a little bit. We talk about graphs and graph edges, and so all that stuff is obvious to me, but to a newcomer, it would never be obvious.
Yep, I think that's fair, and there's definitely some areas of improvement, both on documentation. I think it's primarily documentation, and then there's going to probably be a little bit of work done on like bundle validators, and potentially like the OPM validate command. Although I think that one's probably good. I think there's probably some work to be done on the bundle validators that can tell you about some of these things. It's just a little bit weird in this like migration time when we're trying to like use bundles with both the old imperative workflows and with the new stuff, in which case, if you're using them with the old imperative workflows, all of the existing things that we've all gotten to grow to love, like those still need to stay there, but they're going to be ignored going forward with file-based catalogs and eventually just completely phased out.
Yep, okay.
There needs to be some sort of migration documentation that talks about all of these edge cases and migration cases.
Yeah, I think we should make that as a mandatory part of all of our templates for all of our features and bugs and so forth. Because those are the things that really bite me. Migration and interoperability. Food for thought.
Yep, that seems reasonable.
Yeah, so then I guess the short-term action is if you could give me access to that HackMD document, if you could post it in there, that'd be awesome. Then I can kind of take it to the next level.
It's in the agenda. I'll put it in the Zoom chat as well.
Yep, I see it. Thanks.
All right, then.
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Katia, for that. So let's move on to the last item from Eric on the existing constraint type in a new one. Go ahead.
Thanks.
Eric?
Yeah. The compound constraint CP is pretty close to being done. There's just one point of interest that I want to get some opinions on here. So originally, what was going to happen was the old constraint types, which are the top level OLM.gvk.required and .package.required, were going to be used in addition to any of the OLM.constraint new format constraint types. And this gives some backwards compatibility with bundles, but can lead to conflicts in edge cases, not the general case, but edge cases with OLM.constraint, compound constraints, effectively. So one proposition to make bundles backward compatible with older versions of OLM and compatible with new versions of OLM using the new constraint types, this is from Chris, is to allow both in the bundle, but new versions of OLM would ignore the new ones, or sorry, the old constraint types if OLM.constraint existed anywhere in the bundle. That would allow old OLM versions to operate as they would have on the like older version of the bundle that didn't have OLM.constraint. So nothing would change there. And obviously old or existing OLM versions would ignore any property that they didn't recognize. So OLM.constraint would just be ignored. Everything would work as normal. And new versions of OLM, yeah, they would just ignore the OLM.gvk package required and only operate on the new constraints. So this works and actually does get rid of the edge case with compound constraints, but is very confusing. So having duplicated constraints on my bundle is weird, obviously, because if I specify, you know, OLM.gvk.required within like you look at this and you're like, what's going on here? Why am I and it is that is what's happening unless you read the documentation. And going on the principle of least astonishment that I think we've been trying to stick to recently, that doesn't really make sense. And we should probably go with the former case that I outlined, which is they are used side by side. So you can get rid of your OLM.gvk package required if you want and make them OLM.constraints, or you can keep them as is and add new constraint types and they'll be used as if they were OLM.constraints. Now, I would like to hear people's opinions on one or the other. One benefit of the latter, which is to choose between the two, is you wouldn't need to write two separate bundles, one for old OLM and one for new OLM that uses the new constraint types. You can still write a single bundle theoretically for both. The old OLM would just ignore anything that you've specified in the new bundle, or sorry, as new constraint types, and that's to be expected. Does anybody have any questions on that explanation? That was quite a bit. And there, for the record, there is a better just or more concise discussion in the enhancement proposal PR, which I will link right now. Yeah, opening the floor.
I think, so the example that I was thinking of when I was reading through the EP that I think prompted this discussion is that we're also looking at adding other constraint types outside of compound constraints, like this cell expression based constraint. So it seems completely like if I'm an operator author and I go read Vu's EP about cell constraints, to me it seems immediately obvious that I would immediately go and like, oh great, like I'm gonna go add a cell constraint to my bundle, and now I've got my GVK constraint and my package constraint, and now I've got a cell constraint. And there's some, we'll have some documentation that says, these cell constraints, we're not going to backport this. So old versions of OLM are going to ignore it. But, when you get a new version of OLM, then like you can make operator author, it seems really counterintuitive. And there's nothing that would really prevent them from, well, first of all, it seems the most intuitive thing is all of these existing package and GVK, no one's ever told me that they're deprecated, so I'm going to keep using them. I just want to add this new cell constraint in. So in that case, like I think, again, like as Eric was saying, the principle of least astonishment, I think that user and that operator author would expect that the new version of OLM would interpret and honor all three of those constraints. And it would be very surprising if, because you added a cell constraint, it started ignoring your old existing constraints. So I think my opinion is new OLM version should just honor all of the constraints that it sees the same way it always has. And if you have a use case where you want more fine-grained control of the constraints and dependencies around, maybe you want something that says above this version and I also needed to have this GVK. Like, well, you can't necessarily do that and still support all of the old versions at the same time, old versions of OLM at the same time. So therefore, like, if you need that, make sure that that bundle is only going into a catalog where you know that OLM is going to be running its newer versions that knows how to interpret that. Hopefully I didn't just throw more confusion into the ring, but that's kind of where my head was at when I was reading the EP.
All right, I would like to say something. I'm still trying to process what Eric said early on and what Joe just added more into it. I'm sorry, maybe my brain is not functioning so well today, so I'm not entirely catching up with all the things you said. Admittedly, I haven't seen the thread that Eric mentioned about this specific conversation, but I think at least from my end, on my EP, specifically for the generic constraint, I'm pretty sure I mentioned the fact that all the existing type of constraint, aka dependency, will remaining the same. They will continue to be supported. So essentially, we're just adding a new type constraint that, be generic, and you can pretty much replacing the GVK and the package dependency with the new type constraint or the constraint using cell. But at the same time, they are pretty much equally the same in a way that they just are just a type of constraint that we OM supporting. And obviously, they will continue to be supported. The only thing different between the three of them is that the new OM constraint is the new one that will be supported in the newer version of OM that will be released coming up. And it will not be backported. So that constraint, if you specify that in the bundle, it will not work with the previous version of OM, meaning that the resolver just don't understand that constraint, doesn't understand that constraint, and it's essentially ignoring it or consider just a property that, like you specify GVK property and stuff like that. So it just doesn't work. And to me, that is not something surprising. When the new feature releases is supposed to be working on certain release of OM, and that's just how it's going to be. And if we intend to deprecate it, the GVK and the package dependency, then we probably going to have the plan for that and the timeline for that and so on. But at the moment, there's nothing for that yet. So I'm still trying to understand where the confusion coming from in this specific case. Maybe Eric can explain to me a little bit further?
I think the bottom line, Gu, is that we're, from IBM's perspective, we have one catalog, right? So we expect all of our operators to run on lots of different versions of OLM. And so if we want to start taking advantage of these new features, we're going to have to start splitting off our catalogs then, because we need different properties files depending on the version of OLM that we're going to run on. So either we're going to have, when we've talked about this before, splitting off and having lots of different catalog versions, or, you know, I was thinking outside the box and thinking, well, what if we could have OLM be smart enough to be able to detect, oh, this is actually a new API, right? So if they're using the new API, only digest the new API and don't reread the old API. The old API being the old properties, the new API being the new constraints. That was kind of the idea I had. That allows us to interoperate, although it is confusing, right? Because they're both there. Unless you had some kind of versioning capability in the properties API to say, hey, this version of the API is meant for versions of OLM greater than X, right? This version is, this version of the properties are for version, you know, older versions of OLM. Right, so that allows you at least to segment them out into different files. But you could also model that within, in theory, if you had these, the new general constraint properties, you could model it there too. In theory, if you could look at like the version of Kube you're running on or the version of OLM you're running on. So, I mean, with any API, any storage mechanism, you know, I find it really hard to be able to segment, you know, the parts. You want to start using the new features, but you still want it to run the way it ran before on the old system, right? And then you don't want side effects when running on the new system. So I told Joe, I totally get what you're saying, and I don't necessarily, I don't like it, but I get it because it just creates more work for me.
I mean, I get where you're coming from too. We've talked about in the past, like having some sort of content negotiation protocol, but we don't have that right now. So I'm not sure where that leaves us.
So I think here I would lean towards the, I guess, additive solution, mainly because even though you can't leverage the new constraint types with old OLM, obviously, using these things additively at least gives you some backwards compatibility with old OLM, right? Because you can still keep your top level constraints and add lower level constraints as long as, or sorry, OLM constraints, but OLM dot constraint, as long as you don't hit that edge case. So you can't fully leverage the new constraint types, but the new compound constraints, but you can still use them as long as they're not.
Yeah, in my use cases, I can't use them at all because the nature of the constraints are additive, like you were saying. And so then we can't constrain less. We ended up constraining, I mean, sorry, we can't constrain more, we constrain less. And so then they end up becoming ignored.
Okay, so
I think what you could do, and maybe this is what you're saying, Chris, like if you had a constraint for a package already, and in the future you wanted to have a constraint for a package and an API in that package, that would be possible because the first constraint would be met by the fact that the second one is more specific. So the compound constraint would be the driving factor behind what gets resolved. If you flip it in the other direction, make your original constraint looser, you're right, like you can't make that original thing looser because that original thing stands on its own.
Yeah, my head hurts. Think about this a little bit more. I understand the purist perspective and I understand why it's weird. to do what I suggested.
So what I think, let me try to interpret what Joe just said, the fact that any kind of new constraint type you add into the bundle, and if you deploy that in the OLM version that doesn't supporting that new type constraint, then the existing dependency that you have in the bundle still work. It's just not more restricted, if you know what I mean, assuming you adding a new type constraint to make it more restricted. Is that the case? Like, for example, in this case, you having a GPK dependency already on that bundle, right? So if you deploy in the older version, it's work that way. You deploy it in a newer version of OLM, it still work exact same way. But now you want it to be more specific, more restricted, like want a specific, like Joe just said, in a specific package. So you add the new constraint to make it more specific. Then if you deploy that new version in the old OLM, it still work the same way. It doesn't change anything at all, right? Because still result into the GPK. It just couldn't understand the new type. And then you deploy in the newer version of OLM, it's just going to be more specific to what you want it to be.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. Let me think about this a little bit more. Eric's bringing this forward because I kind of complained about it. And I think this might be a misunderstanding of how the resolver actually works. And so I did, and it was a light bulb moment for me, understanding the resolver actually gets called, I think there's a generation, right? So it actually goes through the whole, each item in the constraints list independently, right?
Correct.
And it comes up with a true or false. And then if the next guy is false, then it has to go through the next generation saying, okay, that one was false. So let's go ahead and do it again from some other iteration. And then it keeps going and going and going, and it keeps filtering it down. So maybe you're right. Maybe I had it backwards in my head.
Yeah. So unless you introduce unless that bundle doesn't have any dependency at all, and you introduce a new dependency into it with the new type, and you try to deploy that in the older version of OLM, and that certainly doesn't work because OLM just doesn't understand it. So that means it will not result into any dependency whatsoever. Then that may be a problem for you. But if you just want the constraint dependency to be resolved, I mean, to be more specific, more restricted, more, refined, so to speak, in this case, then that should work just fine for the old OLM, and then it will work better in the new OLM, so to speak.
Yeah. So Eric, I guess we're out of time. Let me think about this a little bit. Tomorrow's my thinking day. I don't have any meetings tomorrow, so I can think about this a little harder, and I can respond to your PR. And maybe you just leave it the way it was. Right, and then we don't have this problem.
Yeah, we can definitely follow up with this later, and I can also fix up the implementation and get some real reviews on that too. In the meantime,
yeah, the real helpful thing for me is understanding how the resolver is actually invoked with the generations with the constraints. Putting those two back together would be really helpful.
Let me make that mechanism explicit in the document. I do think that would be quite helpful, especially in the context of this decision. So yeah, this was definitely worthwhile bringing up. Thank you for doing that.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much.
Wonderful. All right, we over time already. Yeah, so feel free to tag me on a thread that you guys may have on the enhancement. I do read through enhancement, but not every single thing going on there because quite a lot. So if you need something specifically for me, just tag me on it. I will try to get to it when I can. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Joe, for the discussion. And I think that should be the end of this meeting. And, this is probably the last feature meeting before Christmas. I'm sorry, Thanksgiving. So I just want to say happy Thanksgiving for everyone, especially the folks in the US. And I will see you guys in 2 weeks. And feel free to put up any new item on the agenda for the next meeting after Thanksgiving. And have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you.